Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Vishal Dahiya, and this week we will discuss the issue of ceasefire violations in Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistani Rangers targeted Indian posts and villages along the international border in Jammu late last week. 2 BSF personnel were killed in this heavy and unprovoked firing from the Pakistani side. This intense shelling continued for almost 12 hours in the Pragwal area of Akhnur, Katoch and Khor sectors of Jammu district, making a blatant violation of the agreement reached between the DGMOs of India and Pakistan just a week ago. When the DGMOs met on 29th May, they had agreed to fully implement the Ceasefire Pact of 2003 in letter and spirit to stop the border skirmishes in Jammu and Kashmir. But that was not to be, as Pakistan for the umpteenth time broke its pledge to maintain peace on the border. Earlier this week, a sector commander level meeting was held between the Border Security Force and Pakistani Rangers. The item on the agenda was to ensure peace on the border that was shattered due to intense firing from Pakistani side in the border villages and has led to a complete breakdown of confidence between the two sides. So much so that reports said that the central government may rethink its decision to continue the ceasefire that it enforced during the Ramzan period. Ceasefire violations by Pakistan from across the international border and line of control in Jammu region is not new and has often made life miserable for the civilians living along the border. For more on this today, we have with us in the studio a distinguished panel of guests. Let me start by introducing them to you, beginning with Mr. T.C. Raghavan, former High Commissioner to Pakistan. We also have with us Senior Fellow of ORF, Mr. Sushant Sareen. And we have with us our defense expert today, Major General retired Dhruv Katoch. Welcome all of you to Rajya Sabha TV studios. Let me begin with you, Mr. Raghavan, and let's try and begin by understanding the situation which is prevailing right now in Jammu, specifically along the border.
Well, an incident like this so soon after a high-level agreement between the army headquarters of both sides is self-evidently very serious, and it should not have happened. What could have sparked it is very difficult to say, because as your report said, and as you said, the agreement was reached by the DGMOs barely a week or 8 days ago. Nevertheless, in my view, tactical and local factors sometimes do lead to serious situations on the LOC. And while these should be avoided and every effort should be made to ensure that they do not take place, when they do take place, we should not let it override the overall policy which has been agreed to or which has been followed. The general view, I think, which has now emerged in the Pakistan army is that the ceasefire is as much as in their interest as it is in ours. And certainly we should try to see that the agreement of 2004 is safeguarded to the extent possible, because the last 2 years have been most unsatisfactory insofar as the civilians living on the LOC and on the border is concerned. So I would say that extra efforts need to be made to see that such incidents do not recur.
Okay, extra efforts need to be made. But one point which Mr. Raghavan made, and let me bring Sushant here on this, that the local level factors or local level errors might have been responsible for this. But an agreement reached between DGMOs of both the countries, does it leave some scope anywhere for any mistake to be done by those who are guarding the borders on both sides, when both DGMOs have reached an agreement, and there is seemingly a sense that, as Mr. Raghavan is putting it, that ceasefire is in everybody's interest?
See, in an ideal world, that shouldn't be happening. You know, if at the top level of the military, and I suspect that the agreement which was worked out or which was announced by the two militaries was worked out on the back channel at a political level as well, which is why, you know, if you look at the press release of both sides, they're almost identical. This doesn't happen normally. So I think the assumption that there was a political level understanding as well, which then manifests itself in terms of the ceasefire, would then, the logical expectation would be that there is not the kind of violation which we have seen happen. But look, let's face it, these are things which sometimes happen for the reasons which Ambassador Raghavan is talking about, that at the tactical level, there's accidental firing, which then, snowballs into something bigger. But I think what is more important from my point of view is that once the two DGMOs have decided something, then what happened to the mechanism that even if this was an accidental fire or, some guy from the other side, got it in himself that he's going to fire a couple of shots on the Indians because he doesn't like their face or whatever other reason, then what happened to the mechanism to stop this from escalating to the point that it did? Ultimately, I think it has stopped. The firing seems to have stopped, at least that's what the latest report suggests. But why did it take them 3 days to make sure that this does not reach that point? So I think that is something which we really need to start looking at. The other point is that there might have been some kind of understanding to go in for the ceasefire or re-implement the ceasefire, but has it translated to the rank and file? Perhaps on the Indian side, it certainly looks like it did, but did it also on the Pakistani side? So I think there are going to be questions which are going to be asked. And finally, we have seen this, this is an old Pakistani tactic that you sign something on paper and then you violate it to see how much you can push the envelope. How much do you think the other side will react? That I have signed an agreement with you, I violate it. Will the other side respond in equal measure, or will the other side, calm down? And then I can keep pushing the envelope. That is also something which we have seen in the past. So I think the jury is still out on whether the ceasefire is going to endure, or whether, in many instances in the past, we've reached certain agreements, but, they've not lasted for more than a few weeks or a few months at best. So I don't know. I think it's still early days before we can see how this ceasefire is going to pan out.
Okay, as you pointed out, Sushant, Pakistan has been a repeat offender as far as violation of ceasefire agreements is concerned. Let me bring in Major General Katoch here. General Katoch, if you look at the ceasefire agreement, and you would be better equipped with the knowledge of understanding the nuances of such agreements. So, how would you place the present, ceasefire agreement and its violation in today's context and the way it has turned out, actually?
I think when I'm looking at the Indian Army per se, because they are the ones who are involved, and of course the Central Armed Police Force, so the BSF is involved in this particular case. When firing has taken place over months, and finally we have come to a Ramzan sort of ceasefire, which has been asked for by the Pakistani Army Chief, and then subsequently taken up by the Pakistani DGMO to the Indian side. And then they go and break it. It only suggests two things to me. One, first, that as at the lower level, or let us say at the highest level of the Pakistan Army, they are not in a position to exercise adequate control over the lower level troops. That is one possible explanation. The second one is it part of the Pakistani game plan? As Mr. Sushant Sareen mentioned here, are they trying to push the envelope? Are they trying to see, okay, how much can we push the Indians? Right, we'll say it's an accident, and can we do it again? Because we must remember, they have got certain other constraints too. One is their elections are coming next month, right? How would they like to play the India factor in those elections? The second part of it is infiltration is still a part of the Pakistani agenda. So if they have to infiltrate troops inside, will the ceasefire not go against their attempts to infiltrate?
Okay.
Right? So at the third point, which not directly related to the firing, but it is in a way related to what is happening in certain districts of the Kashmir Valley, right? That we are suddenly seeing a spurt in the stone throwing and pelting at some of the vehicles of the CRPF and the BSF. Now, why is that happening? Now, is this firing support also there? When you break the ceasefire, a cover-up for what is happening, right? Just trying to divert the attention.
Okay.
I really don't know which way the Pakistanis are playing it. I think in my personal view, I think they went in for a ceasefire because they also wanted to show the world, listen, we are in for peace. It is the Indians who are not playing ball, right? But I really don't know if it is part of their self-interest. So I think we need to be careful. I personally am not sanguine that the ceasefire will hold because they are going to repeat it again. And the policy is very straight. If they do anything, the response will be in adequate measure. That means if we will give it, the Indian Army per se will retaliate in a much harsher form than what it has been doing earlier.
Okay, that has been made clear by the government a number of times that retaliation will be an equal measure. Let me bring in Mr. Raghavan here again. And Mr. Raghavan, trying to understand this 2003 ceasefire agreement, why is it in vogue so much now? And why are we moving around this particular ceasefire agreement only?
Well, the 2003 agreement is important because it followed almost 2 decades of virtual daily skirmishes on the line of control. And it acquired a certain larger-than-life importance because of the realization, particularly, I think, in the Pakistan Army, but also in India, that what happens on the line of control is purely tactical in nature. I think the Pakistanis realized this much more consciously after the defeat they suffered in Kargil. But in India also the feeling grew that these tactical skirmishes and these tactical situations really are of no great value for us also. And if we have to move forward for any kind of political dialogue, then you need a certain stability on the line of control, and the ceasefire is the first step towards that. So this really was the thinking at that time. And to my mind, although there are multiple reasons why this current breakdown or this current skirmish has taken place, to my mind, that kind of thinking still exists in both countries. It is not uniformly shared, but that thinking is there, that the LOC is essentially a tactical play, and we should not make it into a doctrinal, should not give it a doctrinal value. So whether you respond proportionately or disproportionately, they remain at the level of tactical responses, and they don't change the overall situation in any meaningful sense.
But what's your viewpoint on what General Katoch was pointing out, and Sushant was also saying that it looks difficult that the ceasefire will actually hold?
Well, I see no particular reason to be unduly pessimistic. With Pakistan, one can never be entirely sure of what is going to happen because of the internal situation in that country, the factors which were mentioned. But the fact that their system came around to a ceasefire as being the best possible option for them and something in their interests suggests that there is a certain momentum attached to it internally in Pakistan too. So I would not be unduly pessimistic. As I said in the beginning, that it was agreed to about 8-9 days ago. Occasionally breakdowns do take place, and efforts should be made to see that the understanding which was reached between the DGMOs is preserved.
Okay, Sushant, your comments on that. Would you still be optimistic about ceasefire holding in with all the points made by Mr. Raghavan here?
Unlike Ambassador Raghavan, I am afraid I am always pessimistic when it comes to Pakistan. I see no reason for any kind of optimism because that's, the 70 years of past history has told us that. The one thing I would always, suggest some caution is that I personally don't think that there is any kind of breakdown if from what General Katoch is saying. Of course, he's also only speculating on that. But I think this is something which the Pakistanis have been using with the rest of the world, that, the General Bajwa is a nice guy, he actually wants peace, but, there are people at the grassroots level who try and play hooky and try and do something or the other. That's utter nonsense. If that is true, then Pakistan is in much, much, much deeper trouble than what we think it is, right? I think the chain of command in the Pakistan Army still stands, which is why I think that if something like this has happened, unless it's pure accident, and accidents do happen, I would suggest that it is part of that game to see how much you can push the other side. You've signed a deal, let's renege on it and let's see how much we can, and then we'll, calibrate our actions accordingly. And that's been standard operating procedure as far as the Pakistanis are concerned. The other thing about, this whole ceasefire business is, I think we shouldn't conflate it with what's happening inside Kashmir. In the sense, very often, we're talking about the Ramzan ceasefire in Kashmir with the ceasefire on the LOC. There are two separate things. From the Pakistani side, I think there's also this whole thing that they want to go into elections. The army is very often used to, monitor the elections, not only monitor, but also provide security to the elections. So if their commitments on the eastern border are going to stay at the levels at which they are, and the border remains hot or the LOC remains hot, then, you know, the Pakistan army cannot divert its troops for this particular duty, election duties. So maybe there is some tactical breathing space that they want. But does it signal, maybe that is what is being spoken about, because there are enough people in India who seem to imagine that a guy like Bajwa can be a partner in peace. But see, I don't see any fundamental change in either the strategic calculus of the Pakistanis or their attitude towards India. At best, these are tactical breathing spaces they look for, but nothing more, nothing less. And once the tactical requirement is over, for example, in Musharraf's case, he tried to enter into a deal. Many people are very enthused by that. But the fact of the matter is that the day Musharraf doffed the uniform, that deal was dead that very day. And not only his successor, but also the succeeding government, which was the so-called liberal according to Pakistani standards, political party taking office, they repudiated the understanding with Musharraf had reached. So anything you get into with Bajwa is not necessarily going to hold with his successor or even with the rest of the army eventually.
So you're saying that Pakistan is only trying to make tactical rooms for itself. Let's bring in General Katoch again on this. General Katoch, does that hold? And do you agree with what Sushant just pointed out? And you also made some comments in your first remarks. Despite the fact that the kind of statements which have come in from the Pakistani army, as Ambassador Raghavan was also pointing out, saying that, ceasefire is in interest for both nations, India as well as Pakistan.
No, let us face it, peace is in the interest of both the nations. Yet we have been in a state of war since 47. Knowing fully well that peace is in our interest, we are in a state of war because that suits the Pakistani military narrative. So the second point is, was this an accidental firing? No, accidental firings don't take place with mortars. Accidental firings do not take place with sniper rifles. And certain press reports indicate that the JCO who died was killed by a sniper rifle. Now, a sniper is a very, very dedicated weapon, right, where you take a pinpoint aim to take out an adversary. It cannot be an accident. An accident is something that people are training on the mortar range and the mortar goes somewhere where it was not intended to go. That can happen, right? Because somebody can make a mistake. But otherwise, accidents do not happen on the line of control or on the international border. So what has happened has been deliberate. And as I mentioned, if it has been deliberate, then obviously there is a purpose behind it. Either the Pakistan army has lost control, and I totally agree with Sushant here, if they have lost control, then I think the situation for the Pakistanis is much more serious than what it would be. There's another point I think which I would like to just highlight here. What exactly does the government of India mean by saying that we are having a ceasefire? What are the ground rules for a ceasefire? Is it simply that there will be no firing from across the border? I think we need to take the definition of ceasefire one step ahead of that. It should also mean there will be no infiltration. Because if there is infiltration, it has to mean it is a violation of the ceasefire, which should give the Indian army the right, and it should be advertised. It will give us the right to destroy not only the infiltrating troops, but the Pakistani posts on either side of those infiltrators, because they are in support and it will be treated as an act of war.
Okay.
So I think we need to, so long as the idea, I'm not a warmonger, right? I mean, I would also say the peace is the better option. But sometimes to get peace, you've got to show the stick. And till such time, if we are firm on this particular idea that, listen, if you misbehave, you will get it.
Okay.
And if you can deliver this message, then you're more likely to get peace than otherwise.
Okay. Looks like Sushant wants to add on something.
Just one thing, taking off from both what General Katoch and what Ambassador Raghavan said. I think, when the 2003 ceasefire was worked out, one of the reasons which propelled that ceasefire working out, and which is why I have a slight disagreement with Ambassador Raghavan, that there is a certain strategic messaging also in what happens on the LOC. I think the firing at the time when the ceasefire was worked out had reached a level that the Pakistanis were not able to sustain the pressure. There was enormous amounts of damage which was caused, and it was consciously done from the Indian side to raise the costs for Pakistani misadventures in terms of infiltration, pushing in terrorists, all sorts of other things. There was a conscious effort to raise the cost for them. I think that is something which also knocked some sense into their heads, that this is not something that they can sustain indefinitely. And that, so to some extent, there is a certain amount of strategic utility also to the ceasefire. But although I agree that if it's just, the minor kind of exchanges which take place, perhaps that is only a local level thing. But you cannot completely divorce the strategic messaging of LOC firing or raising the cost for the enemy, from anything else.
Okay.
I think you need to factor that in, which is what might also be at play at this point in time.
Okay, let me bring in Mr. Raghavan here. And Mr. Raghavan, the point which we would like to bring in now is the interrelation or the correlation between ceasefire violation and infiltration. As General Katoch was pointing out, that is something which is intrinsically, involved here. And we've seen in previous incidents as well that whenever there are incidents of ceasefire violation, the attempts of infiltration increase.
Well, that is true. In the end, it is Pakistan's strategic objective to show that Jammu and Kashmir is a disputed area and people in Jammu and Kashmir are being oppressed, etc., etc. So part of that narrative is to keep the pot boiling, whether by infringements of the ceasefire, whether by firings on the LOC, by pushing in infiltrators, and any other means available to it. That is part of its overall strategy, and that is something which we know and have dealt with for many years. But the larger point is, in a country like India, you see, decisions are not only made on the basis of military calculus, but also on the basis of a political and strategic calculus. If we look at the 2003 ceasefire, it had followed after a very, very successful election in Jammu and Kashmir, and the feeling was that we can consolidate the situation in Jammu and Kashmir and rapidly make progress internally in our state if the situation on its borders is also stable. That was the thinking, and that explained really a great deal of what happened in Jammu and Kashmir for the next 5 or 6 years, which was a good period in the history of that state. And it was a political calculus which was doing the thinking, not just a simple military analysis of a military situation, because if you analyze the situation in military terms, certain options present themselves, but from a political point of view, those options may not be the best ones. Now, this area where this latest incident has taken place, and generally on the IB, what the Pakistan calls the working boundary, is a thickly populated area on both sides. For a country like India to expect that because of military options we exercise, our civilian populations will take the heat of that, or will face a great deal of shelling, people being daily life being affected, many being killed. It's not an acceptable thing for a prolonged period of time. So certainly the idea is that if Pakistan is misbehaving, you teach it a lesson which makes it realize the cost of what it is doing. But you also keep other options open to see as to how can you make some kind of progress, howsoever limited it may be, because it gives some temporary relief to your own citizens and to your people.
Okay, Sushant, now that we are nearing the end of the show, what is the way forward according to you? As Mr. Raghavan also is pointing out, that we have to keep all options open, including the option of putting in a proper retaliatory measure.
No, I think that's quite true. I think that's a truism, really, that you have to keep all options open. You have the military option, of course, and you have to exercise the military option when required. And certainly there is the diplomatic and the political options which also need to be brought into play, depending on what the ground situation is. I don't think the ground situation today is of a type which would lead me to believe that either the ceasefire or any kind of an engagement process with the Pakistanis at this point in time is likely to work. I don't think there is any chance of that succeeding. Just as I don't think that the Ramzan ceasefire in Jammu and Kashmir, it's basically we've rolled the dice to see what happens. It's what I call the Dullat doctrine, that you haven't thought things through, you haven't worked out your plan Bs, you just say something, okay, call something, do something, let's see what happens, throw something up in the air, see if it falls down or it stays up in the air. So we've also started doing stuff like that. So I don't think either the Ramzan ceasefire is going to be able to be very successful in even creating the ground conditions where some kind of a political initiative can take place, nor for that matter on the LOC, any kind of a ceasefire, even if it lasts for much longer than what I expect, I don't see any kind of a political engagement really yield any positive results for any length of time. Maybe temporary, yes, but not substantive.
Not in the longer run. General Katoch, your concluding comments on the way forward?
My concluding comments is, okay, let's wait and watch. Now, in this particular case, right, the Pakistanis have fired, we have lost some men, right? We have retaliated. And now, as of now, things may explode again, but as of now, there is peace. So let's wait and watch. But I personally would not trust anybody from the other side. Also, we must realize that something insidious has taken place over the last 1 week. And that is the Pakistani government has their view on Gilgit-Baltistan, by which they have actually made a doctrinal statement on Gilgit-Baltistan, attempting to convert it as the 5th province of Pakistan, right? And I think that while they are actually moving onto that line, we may actually find the line of control also heating up.
Okay.
So we need to be careful. I won't like to place any faith on any statement given by Pakistan. And I would very strongly urge the military, the army especially, that any act of infiltration to be also treated as an act of war, regardless of the fact that the Pakistanis have fired in their support or not. But if they, the very fact that they have given administrative support, because without that support, the infiltration cannot take place, we need to retaliate.
Okay, so clearly, as our panelists are pointing out, that Pakistan has failed to keep the faith both through its behavior as well as its actions. Therefore, India needs to keep all its options open, including the option to retaliate in equal measure as and when required. We'll come back again next week with a different topic and different set of guests. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.